Alright, so in this video, I am going to be going through the top 10 college football programs of the 14 playoff era. The 14 playoff era did last 10 years, so it is kind of a good gauge to look back at the 10 best programs, just my personal rankings. These rankings are mainly combined with consistency and a big weight on national championships. That is the goal, to win the national title. It's not to make the playoff. Yes, making the playoff and being consistent is important, but winning the national championship, that is by far the number one data point I'm going to be looking at in terms of ranking these teams. Now, when it comes to the number 10 team of the 14 playoff era, I am going to go with Oregon. Now, Oregon started off elite, making the playoff with Marcus Mariota, finishing as the number 2 overall team, losing to Ohio State. Since then, they did not make another playoff, but with Dan Lanning the past 2 years, they've been very good. They also finished at number 14 with Mario Cristobal back in 2021, and they have been consistently ranked for the last 5 years. Yes, they did have a pretty big lull there with a bad hire, but overall, I think Oregon, you could argue a bunch of teams for number 10, but I'm going to throw Oregon in there because they started off really well, finishing number 2 in the country, and they ended extremely strong. They were my number 10 team of the playoff era. Moving on to number 9, it's going to be Notre Dame. So Notre Dame, extremely consistent. Now, you could argue they're an independent that kind of plays in the ACC, and the ACC hasn't been very good recently, but still, you look at their 10 years in the 14 playoff, really good under Brian Kelly. Nothing great. Yes, they did make the playoff 2 times. They lost both times in kind of uncompetitive matchups, but overall, with Marcus Freeman finishing 21st and 16, they've been routinely ranked inside of the polls, a lot of times inside of the top 15, 3 times inside of the top 5 finishing. So with Notre Dame, and I guess you could also say they were in the ACC for 1 year, that really weird 2020 year, and they went 9-0. You know, they beat Clemson. So for Notre Dame, they're coming in at number 9. Even though they did not win a playoff game, still a pretty solid showing from them so far in the playoff era. Moving on to number 8, it is going to be Washington. So Washington with Chris Peterson originally kind of struggling their first few years in 2014, 2015, making the playoff with Jake Browning and John Ross in 2016, losing in the first round. They had 3 straight really good years where they were a fringe top 10 team year in and year out. Yes, they're in the Pac-12. It's a little bit easier, but still, they had a really big lull. And then recently, obviously, one of the big reasons I'm even ranking Washington inside of my top 10 is because of the national championship appearance, where they started 14-0. They went 10-0 in the Pac-12, beating Oregon 2 times. And they did lose their head coach, but still, Washington making the national title. They're my number 8 team. You could argue Washington should be a little bit lower. The Jimmy Lake hire was terrible. They lost a few years with that. You know, also that was kind of during the pandemic. You don't want to say that, use that as an excuse, but still, I don't know, I'll put them at number 8. Moving on to number 7, it is LSU. So LSU could certainly be a lot higher. It just depends how much you value the SEC. Obviously, LSU in the SEC West, it's a very hard schedule year in and year out, beginning with Les Miles. He wasn't a horrible coach, but certainly not up to the standard that they wanted. They end up firing him mid-season after a 2-2 start in 2016, hiring Ed Orgeron, and obviously LSU, they had the greatest team of the 14 playoff era with Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson in 2019, finishing 15-0. After that, they really fell off, really struggled, but with Brian Kelly, they've had 2 decent years, nothing unbelievable, but they did win a national title. They only made the playoff once, but they won the national title, so that's why they're number 7 for me. Moving on to number 6, it is Oklahoma. Oklahoma was really consistent in the 14 playoff, and the Big 12, you could say a little bit easier of a conference, especially with Texas being down most years, but still, originally with Bob Stoops, he gives way to Lincoln Riley. Lincoln Riley goes on a crazy run. Baker Mayfield wins a Heisman. Kyler Murray wins a Heisman. The Jalen Hurts transfer year from Alabama. I mean, this team, look at the consistency from 2015 through 2020. They finished as a top 7 team or better, and they did make the college football playoff 4 times. Unfortunately for them, they're 0-4 in the 14 playoff. So if you want to argue, well, because LSU is 2-0 in the playoff and they won a national title and they're in a tougher conference, they should be ahead of Oklahoma. I just don't think LSU consistently put it together for long enough to be ahead of Oklahoma. Even though they do have one national title in the playoff era, Oklahoma's never even been to the title. I'm going to say that Oklahoma is above LSU when it comes to the 4-team playoff era, and they're the number 6 best team. Moving on to number 5, it is Michigan. Now, obviously, Michigan coming in at number 5, it is heavily based off of what they have done recently. You look at Michigan, the first year of the 4-team playoff, they did still have Brady Hoke. They weren't even ranked a single time in 2014. They get Harbaugh. He has a few pretty good years, really struggles in 2017. Comes back, has another 2 good years, the horrible 2020 season where Michigan went 2-4, and then the 3 straight years where they beat Ohio State, they win the Big Ten, and they finish ranked number 2, and then they go 15-0 and win the national title. Now, we'll see what happens when it comes to the NCAA investigation. But right now, Michigan, even with the inconsistencies throughout this 10-year run, based off the 15-0, based off the 3 straight times of beating Ohio State, they've got to come in at number 5 in terms of the 10 best teams of the 4-team playoff era. Moving on to number 4, it is Ohio State. Now, Ohio State, you look at this, it's pretty crazy. Every single year, all 10 years, they did finish inside of the top 7. At least when it comes to the college football playoff final ranking. I guess you can say with the AP, but they really messed up that Missouri game. Them losing to Missouri had them finish at number 10. Otherwise, they would have been every single quadrant would have been a single digit. But you can see in 2023, they finished number 10 in the AP poll. But yeah, Ohio State, very consistent. They did win the national title in 2014, the first season with Urban Meyer. Urban Meyer ends up giving way to Ryan Day. He retires for a year and then goes to the NFL. And Ryan Day, still a very good coach, but the issues with beating Michigan recently, Ohio State likely will be a top 2 team next year. The reason Ohio State is not higher than number 4, even with these great numbers, they have one national title. They have not won the title since 2014. I value national titles. And also you can say they haven't won the Big Ten, in several years, Michigan winning it the last 3 years, going back to back, and Ohio State losing 3 straight years to their rival. So they come in at number 4, very consistent, just have had some struggles in the playoff, the Clemson loss in 2019, the Georgia loss in 2022. Moving on to number 3, it is Georgia, so the number 3 best team. You can see Georgia started off with Mark Richt kind of struggling there. 2 years they finished unranked in 2015 and 2016. Just crazy considering how talent-rich the state of Georgia is. But in 2017, Kirby Smart turns it around completely, and you can see the run that they have been on. It is ridiculous. They won back-to-back national titles, and then this past year, pretty much everyone knew, they should have been in the playoff. They just missed out on it, and then destroyed FSU and finished 13-1. So look at that, back-to-back-to-back, 14-1, 15-0, 13-1, 2 national titles, elite record in the playoff. And very easily could have another national title. They were beating Alabama 13-0. Bama inserts Tua into the second half, and we all know what happened there in overtime. But either way, Georgia, extremely impressive recently. They come in at number 3. Moving on to the number 2 best team in the 4-team playoff era, it is Clemson. Now, Clemson recently has fallen off a little bit, but if I'm ranking the entirety of the 10 years, Clemson was just ridiculous. You take a look at them in 2014, Dabo Swinney coming onto the scene, 2015, you've got Deshaun Watson, and just look at the run that they went on in terms of first, second, third, second. It's just elite. It was Alabama, it was Clemson. To me, those have got to be the top 2 teams in terms of the playoff era. The only argument I can see people making is, well, Georgia played in a much tougher conference than Clemson, and even though Clemson, they might have more success and a better record because of Georgia playing in the SEC, but I'm not sure if you can argue that. Georgia is in the East. The East is not that hard of a division. I mean, I know the SEC championship is very challenging, but I don't know if you can argue that. I like Clemson at number 2. Recency bias will tell you, no, Clemson should be lower, but guys, if this is based off of 10 years, Clemson, they were an absolute juggernaut powerhouse, and they're number 2. And then number 1, of course, it has to be Alabama. You look at this, it is just ridiculous. They did finish 13th one year. I remember that year they finished 13th. That was with Tua. They went 11-2. I don't know how they finished 13 at 11-2. You'd think that'd be a top 10 record, but yeah, Nick Saban obviously has retired, but it was just a ridiculous run with Bama and Jalen Hurts and Tua Tagovailoa. And remember Jake Coker as well. Yes, Alabama. Also Bryce Young. They obviously had a dynasty, and they were the number one team in terms of the college football playoff era. They made the playoff 8 times, which is 2 more than Clemson, and they won 3 national championships in the playoff era. Clemson and Georgia both won 2 national championships, but Clemson made the playoff 3 more times than Georgia. But either way, guys, that is going to do it for this video on my top 10 college football teams during the 4-team playoff era. Make sure you're following me on X. Link to that's always in the description.